Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really critical subject, American education, all the way from kindergarten up through graduate school. The sources we're looking at today, they paint a pretty stark picture. They argue the system's been in a long decline, facing issues like counterproductive fads and ideological shifts.
And it's quite a comprehensive critique. The researchers themselves noted they were surprised the data wasn't even worse. It suggests these, trends and dogmas haven't even shown their full impact yet.
So our mission for you today is to unpack the evidence. Is there really an academic decline? And how are these institutional issues, these non-academic agendas, actually affecting student performance and campus life?
Let's start with the hard numbers because they do tell a story.
Absolutely. The SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, is probably the most familiar benchmark. If you look at the combined verbal and math scores, well, the trend is pretty clear.
It really is. Scores were around 980 back in 1963.
Right, a high point.
And then they started dropping. They hit a low of 890 around 1980-81.
And even by 1990, they'd only crawled back up to 900. That's still 80 points down from where they were in 63.
There's a huge drop over decades. And it wasn't just math. The average verbal SAT score hit an all-time low in 1991.
Wow.
And beyond test scores, the sources also highlighted some, pretty shocking gaps in basic knowledge among older teenagers.
Yeah, you really have to pause and absorb some of these findings. We're talking about 17-year-olds, almost adults. Nearly a third didn't know Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's fundamental American history.
And nearly half couldn't identify Joseph Stalin, a major figure in the 20th century.
And then there's the geography. About 30% couldn't find Britain on a map of Europe.
So Britain.
Yeah. And this lack of basic factual knowledge, it points towards what the sources call the reasoning gap, which they argue is the deeper crisis.
Explain that a bit more. What's the reasoning gap?
Well, the common pushback you hear from some in education is, oh, those are just mere facts, rote memory stuff.
Right. We teach thinking, not just facts.
Exactly. But that argument kind of falls apart when you look at international comparisons that test actual thinking.
Okay, like that study comparing American and Korean 13-year-olds in science.
Precisely. On questions that just required recalling everyday facts, the U.S. kids did okay. 96% correct versus 100% for the Koreans. Pretty close.
Okay, not much of a gap there.
But then the questions got more complex. Apply simple principles. Americans dropped to 78% correct. Koreans still way up at 93%.
That's a significant difference.
Huge. And then the toughest part, analyze experiments. American students, only 42% correct. The Korean students, 73%.
Wow. So the more thinking required, the wider the gap. It wasn't about knowing stuff, it was about using it.
Exactly. They struggle to process information, to analyze, to apply principles, not just spit back facts.
So if factual knowledge is being downplayed and reasoning skills are weak, what's filling that void? The sources mention this focus on self-esteem.
Yeah, that comes up strongly. There's this telling anecdote. A reporter talking to a student. The student had learned some really basic facts, incorrectly thought North and South Korea fought in the Vietnam War, things like that.
Okay. Basic errors?
But when the reporter pointed this out, the student wasn't bothered. They said something like, the facts didn't really matter because the teacher made us feel like we mattered.
So feeling good trumped being accurate.
That's what it suggests. The feeling of being validated was more important than the actual content. It points to this idea that emotional comfort is being prioritized over intellectual development.
I mean, wanting students to feel valued makes sense on one level, but is the argument that this is happening at the expense of academics?
That's precisely the argument in the sources. And it goes further. They argue that this shift involves deliberate psychological conditioning, often aimed at changing fundamental values, sometimes clashing with what kids learn at home.
Okay, so this takes us into the K-12 curriculum itself. You're talking about these psychological conditioning programs.
Yes. Programs with names like effective education, values clarification, even some forms of sex ed or drug prevention. They take up classroom time, pushing academics aside.
And the sources are quite direct here, aren't they? They argue these programs use techniques similar to, brainwashing.
It's strong language, but that's the claim. They point to methods designed to create emotional stress and desensitize kids.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Things like death education, where students might plan their own funerals, pick out a casket, visit cemeteries, or these lifeboat dilemmas in values clarification, forcing kids to choose who lives and who dies in hypothetical scenarios. High-stress stuff.
Really intense emotional exercises for children?
Very. And another technique mentioned is inducing vulnerability, making students confess personal things.
How so?
They cite things like highly invasive questionnaires. One example from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare back in '79 asked students really explicit questions about their private sexual behaviors. Things like masturbation or petting.
Wow, that's incredibly personal for a school questionnaire.
The argument is that this strips away defenses, makes students vulnerable, and crucially, it often involves isolating them from parental influence.
How does that work?
Parents are sometimes seen as an obstacle. The sources document cases across multiple states, Georgia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Oregon, where teachers explicitly told students not to discuss the specifics of these classes with their parents.
So keeping parents in the dark while dealing with these highly sensitive emotional topics.
Exactly. The focus shifts from knowledge to feelings, beliefs, values. And this emotional intensity, particularly around topics like sex or nuclear war, apparently had real-world consequences.
Physical consequences.
Yes. The sources mention reports from doctors and parents, kids developing nightmares, stomach aches, vomiting, even stuttering, sometimes needing medical help, seemingly triggered by the anxiety these programs induce.
That's quite disturbing, a heavy cost for focusing on feelings over facts.
It certainly raises questions.
Okay, so that covers some of the curriculum concerns. Let's pivot to the institutional side, specifically money. The common refrain is always, we need more funding for schools.
Right. More money equals better education. It seems logical.
But the sources really challenge that idea head on. They found a surprisingly weak link between how much is spent and how well students actually do.
Yeah, this is really counterintuitive. They give the example of Connecticut versus Vermont back in '84. Connecticut spent way more per student, over $4,000. Vermont spent under $3,000.
And Connecticut had better scores.
Nope. Lower scores than Vermont.
So spending more didn't help.
And there's a bigger paradox. School spending per student actually went up significantly in real terms during the '60s and '70s.
The exact period when those SAT scores were plummeting.
Precisely. Spending rose by 58% in the '60s, 27% in the '70s, adjusted for inflation, all while test scores were going down.
So if the money wasn't improving scores, where was it going?
Bureaucracy, mostly. Administrative bloat. Studies they cited from New York City and Milwaukee were pretty damning. In New York, less than half the money spent per high school student even made it to the actual school building. In Milwaukee, less than a third of the elementary school funding went to classroom services.
So the increases were just getting absorbed by the system, not reaching the classroom.
Largely, yes, which points to a lack of financial accountability. And that mirrors a lack of professional accountability when it comes to teacher quality.
Ah, yes. Teacher quality. The sources use pretty strong language here, describing the intellectual caliber of some teachers as shockingly low.
They argue the system protects incompetence. Pay is based on years on the job and degrees earned, not on whether the teacher is actually effective.
And it's hard to remove ineffective teachers.
Extremely hard. They give this almost unbelievable example from South Carolina. A teacher who couldn't pronounce or define agrarian, defined ratify as to get rid of something.
Basic vocabulary for a teacher?
You'd think. But a judge ordered her reinstated after she was fired. The system makes accountability very difficult.
This pattern of institutional agendas trumping educational goals, it seems to pop up again with bilingual education.
It does. The argument isn't against helping non-English speakers, but against how the programs actually operated. The data suggested the main goal became maximizing enrollment numbers.
How did they show that?
A national study found only 16% of kids in these programs spoke only Spanish, the group you'd assume they were designed for.
Only 16%. So who else was in them?
Well, 2/3 of the Hispanic students enrolled were already fluent in English. They didn't actually need bilingual instruction, but they boosted the program's numbers.
And this was happening even if parents didn't want it?
Often, yes. The sources cite surveys showing huge majorities of Mexican-American and Cuban-American parents, over 3/4 and 4/5 respectively, wanted their kids focused on mastering English, not being taught in Spanish at English's expense.
But their wishes were overridden.
By what the sources call the powerful bilingual lobby, it's presented as another case of the institution's agenda taking precedence over the needs or desires of the families and students.
That does seem like a clear parallel, which actually leads us neatly into higher education, where different kinds of misplaced priorities emerge.
Right. If K-12 is dealing with these psychological fads, universities, especially elite ones, seem increasingly driven by marketing and image.
Like selling a product rather than offering an education.
That's the vibe. Consultants advise colleges that perception is the ultimate reality.
Yeah.
Focus on the glossy brochures, the pictures.
Keep the text light.
Exactly. One piece of advice quoted was, a viewbook shouldn't have too much content. Don't bog people down with, academic substance.
Just sell the image, and they even game the selectivity statistics.
Yeah, by encouraging applications from students they know they'll reject. More rejections makes the college look more selective in rankings, even if it's artificial.
Okay, so the marketing is one thing. What about admissions decisions themselves? Are they based on academics?
Less and less, according to the sources. There's a shift towards judging the whole person, trying to assess character, leadership, these kind of fuzzy qualities.
Instead of focusing on test scores and grades.
It seems so. This leads to some really weird outcomes. Elite schools like Amherst and Stanford were rejecting a majority of applicants who had top-tier SAT scores, 750, 800 verbal.
Rejecting the top scorers, why?
Ostensibly to admit others who might have lower scores, but possess these other desirable non-academic traits. Stanford admitted over 100 students with verbal scores below 500, while rejecting most of the 700-plus crowd.
The scholar Jacques Barson called this fuzzy psychologizing, right? Suggesting it favors kids who are good at playing the game, the precocious worldling.
Or the instinctive hypocrite was his other phrase. It suggests intellectual merit isn't the prime currency anymore.
And this de-emphasis on academics seems to carry over to how universities treat their own faculty, particularly the balance between teaching and research.
Definitely. Especially at major research universities, there's a clear hierarchy. Research is king. Teaching, well, it's often secondary.
Is that where the kiss of death idea comes in?
Exactly. The sources report this disturbing pattern. Young, untenured faculty members win awards for outstanding teaching.
You'd think that would be great for their career.
You would. But then they get denied tenure. It's happened to top places, MIT, Stanford, UPenn, Ohio State. The message seems to be, focus too much on teaching undergraduates, and you jeopardize your future. Research publications are what really count for tenure.
So the incentives are skewed away from undergraduate teaching. Now, going back to admissions, if merit is compromised for the whole person, what about deliberate preferential policies? The sources talk about mismatching.
Right. Let's be clear what that means in this context.
Yeah.
The argument is that when students are admitted preferentially, whether they're athletes, legacies, or under affirmative action policies, they often end up in academic environments they aren't fully prepared for.
And the consequences?
Higher failure rates for those specific groups. It's not about the group itself, but the mismatch between their preparation and the demands of the institution.
Is there data to back that up?
Yes. Berkeley, for example. They admitted more black students over the years under these policies, but by 1987, fewer black students were actually graduating than 11 years prior.
So admissions went up, but completions went down.
Exactly. And nationally, the figure cited was stark. 74% of black students hadn't graduated 5 years after starting college. The mismatch has real academic consequences.
And Judge Macklin Fleming predicted a behavioral consequence too, didn't he?
He did. He warned that putting academically mismatched students together would likely lead the less prepared group to feel inadequate and then, understandably, push for changes, demand lower standards, seek courses that are less analytically rigorous, engage in campus agitation.
Which might connect to the rising tensions we hear about on campuses. The sources suggest the college's own policies might be fueling hostility.
They draw that link, yes. And they point to perceived double standards in how campuses handle ideological conflicts. We have to report this impartially, but the examples given are illustrative.
Like the tough student punished for a beer is better than women t-shirt.
Right? Discipline for harassment. But then the head of the Black Students Union at Stanford declared publicly, I do not like white people, and faced apparently no administrative condemnation.
So different responses depending on the group and the message.
That's the perception highlighted. Another example was Dartmouth. 3 white students skated onto the ice wearing Native American regalia, seen as challenging the removal of the old Indians team name. They were suspended, lost tuition, lost academic credit. It was treated as a serious ideological crime.
Meanwhile, other forms of disruption might go unpunished. It suggests inconsistent application of rules based on perceived political correctness.
And while colleges tell parents to let go, the sources argue the universities themselves engage in pretty heavy-handed indoctrination.
Especially around social and sexual attitudes.
Yes. Stanford, again, distributing sex education kits, holding those condom testing contests where students rated them on taste and smell, urging them to be creative, have fun. It's promoting a very specific, non-judgmental viewpoint.
And it goes beyond just voluntary activities, right? Mandatory workshops.
Exactly. Mandatory sensitivity workshops in dorms. Places like UC Santa Cruz, University of Michigan, teaching students the proper views on race, gender, sexuality. The sources describe these as turning dorms into re-education camps.
Strong words again.
They are. And the human toll of enforcing this kind of ideological conformity is tragically illustrated by the Samuel Burke story at Harvard.
Remind us of that one.
He was a student, a football player, lost his father, got injured so he couldn't play football anymore, and then got hit with disciplinary probation for ideological reasons, apparently making insensitive jokes. He committed suicide shortly after.
It suggests a lack of basic human compassion in the pursuit of ideological purity.
That's certainly how the sources frame it, a zealotry that overrides humane considerations.
So pulling all these threads together from K-12 through higher ed, the overall conclusion from these sources seems to be the system is fundamentally broken.
Bankrupt is the word they use. Institutionally bankrupt. Not for lack of money, but because of these deep-seated institutional flaws, fads, and ideological agendas.
And they argue these non-academic goals often backfire.
Completely. They haven't achieved better emotional well-being, social harmony. Often the opposite. Think about teen pregnancy rates rising alongside widespread sex ed programs. The efforts have often been counterproductive.
And the kicker seems to be the total lack of accountability.
Precisely. The people promoting and running these systems, the educators, the administrators, they face no real consequences if things go wrong, if students are harmed academically or emotionally.
A cost falls on
Students and the parents, who are often sidelined but then expected to pick up the pieces.
And the sources argue that the establishment actively fights against accountability measures.
Fiercely. Anything that introduces real competition or allows for widespread monitoring of performance, like parental choice or school vouchers, faces enormous political opposition from the education establishment and its allies.
Because it threatens the institutional status quo.
Exactly. The final point the sources really hammer home is that the most important fairness isn't fairness to these institutions, it's a fairness to children.
Which leaves us with a really challenging question for you, the listener. If these sources are right, and the institutions themselves, with their entrenched interests, are the core problem.
And if they actively fight mechanisms like choice or competition,
then what else could possibly force the system towards accountability? How can academic rigor be prioritized and students protected from these non-academic agendas when the establishment itself resists reform so strongly?
It really puts the focus on the immense challenge of institutional change, doesn't it? Thank you for diving deep with us today.